There are moments in history so saturated with violence and revulsion that they seem to tear a hole in the fabric of time, moments of such pure, visceral rejection that they echo for millennia. One such moment unfolded in the muddy, filth-choked streets of Rome in the year 222. Two bodies, stripped and mutilated, were being dragged by iron hooks through the city. One belonged to a woman, Julia Simias, but it was the other that drew the mob's deepest reserves of fury. It was the corpse of her son, a boy of just 18, who for 4 short, cataclysmic years had been the master of the Roman world. He had been hailed as Emperor Caesar Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus, but that was not his true name. He was born Varius Avitus Bassianus, but that was not the name he chose. He called himself after his god, Elagabalus, and it was a name Rome would come to curse. As the Praetorian Guards, the very soldiers sworn to protect him, hauled his broken body towards the Tiber River, they first tried to defile it in the ultimate way, by jamming it headfirst into a sewer. But the opening was too small for the boy emperor's corpse. Thwarted in this final act of indignity, they dragged him instead to the river's edge, weighted the body down, and hurled it into the brown water, ensuring that he would have no tomb, no burial, no peace. They wanted to erase him not just from the world of the living, but from the memory of mankind itself. How does this happen? How does a 14-year-old boy from a distant province in Syria ascend to the most powerful throne on earth, only to be so comprehensively loathed, so utterly despised, that his end becomes one of the most savage and ignominious in the long, bloody annals of the Roman Empire? The traditional histories, written by his enemies, paint a simple picture: a monster of depravity, a transgressive tyrant whose reign was an unending carnival of sexual deviancy, blasphemy, and misrule. But the truth is infinitely more complex and far more tragic. This was not merely the story of a debauched teenager. It was the story of a fatal collision between two irreconcilable worlds. It was the story of a boy who was not a politician or a soldier, but a god-king, a hereditary high priest who believed his own divinity, and who tried to impose his ecstatic, mystical, and deeply foreign faith upon the pragmatic, martial, and profoundly conservative heart of Rome. He was a priest in a city that demanded a general, a prophet in a system that required a bureaucrat. His downfall was not an accident. It was an inevitability, born of a spectacular and catastrophic misunderstanding of power, religion, and the very soul of the empire he was chosen to rule. This is the story of the sacred alien, the boy priest who became emperor, and the price he paid for trying to make Rome kneel not to him, but to his son. To understand the catastrophe of Elagabalus's reign, one must first leave Rome entirely and travel east to the ancient city of Emesa in the Roman province of Syria. Here, under the hot sun, amidst the scent of incense and roasting sacrificial meat, stood a temple of immense local power and wealth. It was not dedicated to Jupiter or Mars, but to a much older, more primal deity, Elgabal, a sun god personified not by a humanoid statue, but by a large, conical black meteorite, a Beetle believed to have fallen from the heavens. This was not the distant, state-sanctioned religion of the Roman Forum. This was a faith of ecstatic dance, of clashing cymbals, of priests in shimmering silks and ornate jewelry, their eyes lined with kohl, who served a living, tangible God. And the high priesthood of this potent cult was hereditary, passed down through the generations of a single, enormously influential family. It was into this world that Varius Avitus Bassianus was born in the year 204. From his earliest moments, he was not groomed to be a senator or a soldier, but a holy vessel. His world was the temple precinct, his destiny to become the chief intermediary between his people and their celestial patron. His family was no ordinary provincial dynasty. His maternal grandmother was Julia Misa, a woman of terrifying ambition and political genius. Misa's own sister was Julia Domna, the brilliant and powerful wife of the Emperor Septimius Severus. This meant the boy from Emesa was a member of the imperial family, a grandnephew of an empress. His mother, Julia Simias, and his aunt, Julia Mamaea, were likewise steeped in the politics and power of the Severan court. They were Syrian aristocrats who had tasted Roman power at the highest level, and they understood its mechanisms. The boy grew up surrounded by these formidable women, learning not the Roman virtues of gravitas and martial discipline, but the rituals of his temple and the intrigues of a court ruled by women who operated from behind the throne. His reality was one where divine authority and earthly power were inextricably linked, where the sacred and the political were two sides of the same coin. He was taught that he was special, set apart, destined for a spiritual greatness that conferred its own unique form of kingship. The Rome he was destined to rule was a world away, not just geographically, but ideologically. By the early 3rd century, the Roman Empire was a sprawling, multicultural entity, but its center of gravity, its identity, was still rooted in the traditions of the old republic. The emperor was, in theory, the princeps, the first citizen. He was the chief general, the chief priest, and the chief magistrate, but his power rested on a delicate fiction, that he was the servant of the Roman state and its people, embodied by the Senate. He was expected to be a man among men, albeit the first among them. He should be stern, disciplined, accessible, and above all, a soldier. The legions were the ultimate source of his power, and their loyalty had to be constantly earned on the battlefield and through donatives. His religious duties were paramount, but were primarily a function of his political office. He was the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, responsible for maintaining the Pax Deorum, the peace with the gods, by correctly performing the ancient, state-sanctioned rituals. To the Romans, religion was a contract with the divine, a matter of public duty and orthopraxy, not a path to personal ecstatic experience. The idea of an emperor who was himself a god in the flesh, or the servant of a foreign deity more powerful than Jupiter Optimus Maximus, was not just alien. It was profoundly threatening. The stage for the boy's ascension was set by blood and betrayal. In 217, the Emperor Caracalla, son of Septimius Severus and Julia Domna, and thus Elagabalus's own cousin once removed, was assassinated. Power was seized by his praetorian prefect, Macrinus, a man of equestrian, not senatorial, rank. One of Macrinus's first acts was to consolidate his power by removing the remaining Severan influence from Rome. He exiled the powerful Julia Misa, along with her daughters Simias and Mamaea and her 2 grandsons, Elagabalus and his younger cousin Alexander, back to their home in Syria. For Macrinus, it was a move to secure his dynasty. For Julia Misa, it was an intolerable insult and a call to war. From her exile in Emesa, she looked at her 2 grandsons. The younger, Alexander, was a quiet, sober child. But the elder, Varius of Vitus, now 14 years old and the serving high priest of Elgabal, was handsome, charismatic, and photogenic. It was then that Misa concocted a brilliant and audacious lie. She began to spread a rumor, whispering it into the receptive ears of the soldiers of the 3rd Gallic Legion stationed nearby. This boy, this priest, was not the son of his putative father. He was, she claimed, the secret, illegitimate son of the beloved and now deified Caracalla. This was a masterstroke of political propaganda. The soldiers had admired Caracalla and despised Macrinus, the usurper who had murdered him. Now, here was a living heir, a direct link to the legitimate dynasty. To seal the deal, Misa opened her vast family coffers, promising an enormous donative to the legion if they would proclaim her grandson emperor. On the night of May 16th, 218, the trap was sprung. The 14-year-old boy, dressed not in a toga or armor, but in the lavish, gold-embroidered silk robes of his priesthood, was smuggled into the legionary camp. There, under the torchlight, this beautiful, exotic-looking youth was presented to the soldiers as the true son of Caracalla. The legion, bought with gold and seduced by the story, proclaimed him emperor. The boy priest of Emesa was now, by right of military acclamation, the ruler of the Roman world. The rebellion had begun. The new emperor, or rather the formidable women directing him, had to cement their claim with force. The reigning emperor, Macrinus, mobilized his own legions to crush the Syrian pretender. The decisive clash came on June 8, 218, at the Battle of Antioch. The battle itself was a near disaster for the rebels. The professional soldiers of Macrinus's army, particularly the Praetorian Guard, began to push back the less experienced troops of the Third Gallic. The rebels' lines buckled and began to break. It was at this critical moment that the rebellion was saved not by its boy emperor, but by his grandmother and mother. According to the historian Herodian, Julia Misa and Julia Simias, seeing their soldiers flee, leaped from their chariots and ran into the heart of the fray. They stood before the retreating men, grabbing them, pleading with them, shaming them with their courage. Inspired by the sight of these two noble women risking death, the troops rallied. Their resolve stiffened, and they launched a ferocious counterattack that ultimately overwhelmed Macrinus's forces. Macrinus himself fled the field, was captured a short time later, and executed. His son and heir, Didomenian, met the same fate. At 14 years old, the high priest of Elgebal was the undisputed master of the Roman Empire. His victory, however, was the start of a far greater conflict. The immediate aftermath in Rome was one of wary acceptance. The Senate, a body that had long lost its real power, had little choice but to officially recognize the new emperor and condemn the memory of Macrinus. They dutifully confirmed the boy's fabricated lineage, formally adopting him into the Aurelian family and granting him the name Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, a name deliberately chosen to evoke the revered 2nd century emperors. This was the name that would appear on coins and inscriptions, a mask of Roman legitimacy for a deeply un-Roman ruler. But the first signs of the coming storm appeared almost immediately. Elagabalus did not rush to Rome to claim his throne. Instead, he and his court spent the winter of 218 to 219 in Nicomedia, in modern-day Turkey. It was from there that he made a decision that sent a profound shockwave across the empire. He commissioned a full-length portrait of himself, not in the armor of a general or the toga of a senator, but in his full, magnificent regalia as the high priest of Elgebal. He was depicted making an offering to his conical black stone idol. He then had this massive painting shipped to Rome with explicit instructions. It was to be hung in the Curia Julia, the Senate house, directly above the altar of the goddess Victory. The symbolism was as deliberate as it was blasphemous. From that day forward, every senator who entered the chamber to conduct the business of the Roman state would be forced to burn incense and make an offering, not to the traditional goddess of Roman triumph, but to the image of a foreign god and his effeminate-looking priest-king. It was a declaration that his authority and the authority of his god superseded the Roman state itself. The boy had not yet even set foot in his capital, but he had already declared war on its most sacred traditions. The senators in Rome, looking up at that strange, painted figure, must have felt a cold dread. They were not getting a new emperor. They were getting a new god, and his demands were only just beginning. The full scale of Elagabalus's revolutionary project became terrifyingly clear upon his arrival in Rome in the late summer of 219. The city, accustomed to the grand triumphs of conquering generals, was instead treated to a religious procession of a kind it had never witnessed. At its center was not the emperor himself, but his god, the black stone of Emesa, housed in a magnificent chariot drawn by 6 white horses, with the emperor walking backwards before it, humbly tending to his deity. For Elagabalus, this was the natural order of things. The god was the true ruler, and he was merely its chief servant. For the people of Rome, it was a bizarre and unsettling spectacle. This was not the gravitas they expected from their leader. This was the behavior of an exotic priest, not a Roman emperor. His first and most consuming priority was not military reform or administrative appointments, but the construction of a new center for the universe. On the sacred Palatine Hill, the traditional home of Roman emperors, he began the construction of a lavish temple, the Eligabalium. This was to be the new home of his god, whom he now officially syncretized with the Roman sun god and renamed Deus Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun god. But this was not to be just another temple in Rome's crowded pantheon. Elagabalus envisioned it as the final destination for all Roman worship. In an act of sacrilege that horrified the traditionalists, he ordered the most sacred objects of Roman religion to be forcibly removed from their ancient sanctuaries and transferred to the Eligabalium. This included the eternal flame from the Temple of Vesta, tended by the Vestal Virgins, the Palladium, a sacred statue of Athena said to have been rescued from Troy, and the holy shields of the god Mars. His intent was explicit and shocking. He declared that no god could be worshipped in Rome except as a subordinate servant in the court of Elgabal. He was not adding a new god to the Roman pantheon. He was attempting to systematically dismantle it and replace it with a single, supreme solar deity, with himself as its earthly manifestation. The religious upheaval was matched by a social one. He elevated his mother, Julia Suemias, and his grandmother, Julia Misa, to the Senate, granting them the right to vote, an unprecedented breach of tradition. Suemias was even given the title Augusta and effectively acted as a co-ruler, her name appearing alongside his unofficial documents. While Julia Misa had been the true architect of his rise, she was a pragmatist who understood the limits of Roman tolerance. Suemias, however, seemed to share her son's religious fervor and encouraged his most extreme behaviors. The court itself was transformed. Power was stripped from experienced senators and generals and handed to a coterie of Syrian favorites and low-born individuals whose only qualification was their loyalty to the emperor. According to the hostile accounts of Cassius Dio and Herodian, positions of immense power were distributed with reckless abandon. A dancer named Gordius was allegedly made prefect of the Vigiles, the city's police and fire brigade. A charioteer named Protogenes was put in charge of a major department. The position of Praetorian prefect, the second most powerful job in the empire, was given to a man named Kamazon, a former actor who had been a comrade of the emperor in Syria. Whether these accounts are literally true or exaggerated propaganda, the message was clear. The old Roman elite, with its emphasis on experience, lineage, and public service, was being systematically replaced by a new hierarchy based on personal favor and devotion to the new god-king. Perhaps nothing symbolized the emperor's complete break with Roman mores more than his series of marriages. His first marriage, to Julia Cornelia Paula, was a conventional aristocratic match likely arranged by Julia Misa to placate the elite. He soon divorced her. His next choice of bride created a scandal that echoed across the city. He took as his wife Aquilia Severa, a Vestal Virgin. This was a violation of one of Rome's most profound religious taboos. A Vestal was sworn to 30 years of absolute chastity, symbolizing the purity and endurance of the Roman state. The penalty for breaking this vow was to be sealed in a chamber and buried alive. Elagabalus, however, brushed aside centuries of sacred law with a chillingly logical explanation. He, the high priest of the sun god, should naturally marry a high priestess. Their union, he proclaimed, would produce godlike children. He was attempting to create a divine royal family, a concept utterly alien to the Roman political imagination. He would later divorce Severa, marry another woman, Aeneia Faustina, a descendant of Marcus Aurelius, and then divorce her to remarry Severa. These 5 marriages in just 4 years created an atmosphere of chaotic instability, but it was the marriage to the Vestal that left the deepest scar, a wound of pure blasphemy in the Roman mind. The contemporary histories, all written by men of the senatorial class who despised him, also cataloged a litany of personal behaviors that they presented as proof of his degeneracy. They claimed he wore makeup, wigs, and flowing silk garments, eschewing the masculine toga. They reported that he would hold lavish, bizarre banquets where guests might be smothered by a cascade of flower petals released from the ceiling. Most scandalously, they detailed his relationships with men. He was said to be deeply devoted to his chariot driver, a handsome blonde Carian slave named Hierocles. According to Cassius Dio, Elagabalus referred to Hierocles as his husband, delighted in being called his queen, and even offered vast sums of money to any physician who could surgically transform him into a woman. He also allegedly established a network of brothels throughout the palace and the city, sometimes personally participating, mimicking the gestures and voices of female prostitutes. It is impossible now to separate the truth from the lurid propaganda designed to delegitimize him. Some modern scholars have interpreted these accounts as evidence that Elagabalus may have been a transgender figure, one of the earliest documented in Western history. Others see it as the hostile framing of Eastern religious practices, where priests often adopted androgynous personas to better serve a goddess or blur the lines between the human and divine. Whatever the reality, for the Roman elite, this behavior was the antithesis of everything an emperor should be. He had failed the fundamental test of Roman masculinity, and in their eyes, this invalidated his right to rule as completely as his religious heresies. The architect of the entire affair, the calculating Julia Misa, watched this unfolding disaster with growing horror. Her plan had backfired spectacularly. She had intended to use her grandson as a handsome, pliable puppet to restore the Severan dynasty and her own family's power. She had assumed that once in Rome, he would shed the provincial oddities of his youth and learn to play the part of a Roman emperor. Instead, she discovered to her dismay that the boy was not playing a part. He was a true believer. His religious revolution was not a political tool. It was the entire purpose of his existence. He was uncontrollable, a zealot who was systematically alienating the two institutions that kept an emperor in power: the Senate, whom he treated with contempt, and the military, who were disgusted by his unmartial bearing and obsession with his Syrian superstition. Misa realized that her grandson was a dead man walking, and that if he went down, he would take the entire dynasty with him. A new plan was needed, a course correction before it was too late. Her solution was to create an alternative. She turned her attention to her other grandson, the son of her other daughter, Julia Mamaea. His name was Bassianus Alexianus, a quiet, serious, and traditionally minded boy of about 12. He was everything Elagabalus was not: sober, modest, and willing to be guided. Misa began a campaign to persuade the increasingly erratic emperor to formally adopt his young cousin as his son and heir, granting him the title of Caesar. Her argument was pragmatic. Elagabalus was busy with his sacred duties to his god, so he needed a Caesar to handle the mundane, temporal affairs of the empire. Perhaps flattered, or perhaps simply not seeing the trap being laid, Elagabalus agreed. In 221, the young boy was adopted and his name was changed to Marcus Aurelius Severus Alexander. Julia Misa now had her insurance policy. She immediately began to groom Alexander for power, ensuring he received a traditional Roman education. She presented him to the senators as a model of old-fashioned Roman virtue, a stark contrast to the alien emperor. Most critically, she used her vast wealth to cultivate the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard towards Alexander, presenting him as a future soldier emperor they could respect. This move fatally fractured the imperial court. It did not take long for Elagabalus to recognize the threat. He saw the growing popularity of his young cousin, saw how the senators and soldiers flocked to him. Alexander was becoming the focal point for all the resentment and hatred directed at the emperor. His own creation was turning into his rival. The jealousy festered, fueled by his mother, Julia Simias, who saw her son's position being undermined by her aunt and sister. The palace on the Palatine Hill became a battleground for two competing factions, led by two sisters, Soaemias backing her son Elagabalus, and Mamaea, with Misa's support, backing hers. Elagabalus began to regret his decision. He tried to reverse it, attempting to strip Alexander of his titles and honors. He forbade senators from visiting his cousin and sought to isolate him. But it was too late. Alexander had become a symbol of hope, the designated savior of Roman tradition. The emperor's paranoia intensified. He made several clumsy attempts to have Alexander assassinated, But the boy was too well protected by his mother, his grandmother, and crucially, by the Praetorian Guard who now saw him as their future. The final, desperate move came in early March of 222. Convinced he had to eliminate his rival once and for all, Elagabalus spread a rumor that Alexander was gravely ill, on the verge of death, to test the reaction of the soldiers. The reaction was not what he expected. The news that Alexander was dying, which the Praetorians rightly suspected was a lie presaging his murder, was the final spark that ignited the powder keg. The guards of the Praetorian camp on the edge of the city went into open mutiny. They refused to perform their duties until they were shown that their beloved Caesar, Alexander, was alive and well. Trapped and panicking, Elagabalus had no choice. In a desperate attempt to appease them, he agreed to present himself at their camp, with his cousin Alexander at his side. On what was likely March 11th or 12th, 222, the two cousins, the 18-year-old emperor and the 13-year-old Caesar, entered the Praetorian fortress. The scene that greeted them was chilling. The soldiers cheered rapturously for Alexander, lifting him onto their shoulders. For Elagabalus, there was only a stony, contemptuous silence. The power dynamic had been laid bare for all to see. Enraged by this public humiliation, his authority shattered, Elagabalus lost control. He ordered the arrest and execution of the soldiers he deemed most responsible for the insubordinate display of affection for Alexander. It was a fatal command. This was not a distant legion he was ordering around. These were the kingmakers, the elite troops who held the fate of Rome in their hands, and he was threatening their comrades inside their own fortress. The order to arrest the ringleaders was met with a roar of defiance. The situation instantly exploded from mutiny into a full-blown insurrection. The guards loyal to Alexander turned on the small contingent of guards who remained loyal to the emperor. A bloody skirmish erupted within the camp walls. Seeing that all was lost, Elagabalus and his mother, Julia Simias, who had accompanied him, fled for their lives. They found a hiding place in the most wretched corner of the camp, a latrine. There, the master of the world and his mother, the Augusta, huddled in the filth, trying to conceal themselves inside a large storage chest. Their sanctuary was fleeting. The enraged soldiers, now on a hunt, found them. They dragged the emperor and his mother from their hiding place. There was no trial, no pretense of justice. There, in the squalor of the camp latrine, the soldiers hacked them to death. According to the histories, Soemias died clinging to her son, trying to shield him, a final, futile act of maternal devotion. The 18-year-old boy who had walked backwards in reverence before his god was butchered by the very men paid to be his protectors. The climax of his reign was as swift, brutal, and squalid as his rule had been alien and provocative. The priest-king was dead, and Rome's fever was about to break. The killing was only the beginning. The soldiers' fury, pent up over 4 years of what they saw as national humiliation, was unleashed upon the bodies with a methodical savagery. After murdering Elagabalus and Soemias, they decapitated them. They then tied hooks to the corpses and began to drag them out of the camp and through the streets of Rome. This was not a chaotic riot. It was a ritual of public cleansing. The body of the emperor's hated mother was disposed of unceremoniously, but for the emperor himself, a special journey of degradation was planned. The mob, led by the soldiers, paraded his mutilated corpse through the city, past the Forum, past the Circus Maximus, where he had once presided over races, a spectacle of ultimate debasement. As if this were not enough, they made their way to the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer, with the intention of stuffing the body into its foul depths. It was a symbolic act of consigning him to the city's filth forever. When the corpse proved too large for the sewer's opening, they dragged it onward to the banks of the Tiber. There, they attached weights to it and cast it into the murky water, a final act of damnation designed to deny him a proper burial and ensure his ghost would never find rest. With Elagabalus dead, power passed seamlessly to the 13-year-old Severus Alexander. The true power, however, now rested firmly with the two women who had engineered the coup, the boy's mother, Julia Mamaea, and his grandmother, the ever-resourceful Julia Misa. Their first order of business was a systematic and total erasure of the previous reign. The Senate, overjoyed at their deliverance, enthusiastically decreed a formal damnatio memoriae. This damnation of memory was the Roman state's ultimate punishment. Elagabalus's name was chiseled off every monument, every inscription, and every milestone in the empire. His statues were pulled down and destroyed. His laws were rescinded. The official narrative was swiftly established and ruthlessly enforced. Rome had been afflicted by a monstrous, foreign tyrant, a stain on its honor, and now, with the accession of the virtuous young Alexander, order, tradition, and Roman dignity were restored. The religious revolution was dismantled as quickly as it had been built. The Elagabalium on the Palatine was rededicated to Jupiter the Avenger. All the sacred relics that Elagabalus had sacrilegiously gathered, the Vestal fire, the Palladium, the shields of Mars, were ceremoniously returned to their original shrines. The conical black stone, the physical form of the god El-Gabal, which had been the cause of it all, was quietly stripped of its honors and shipped back to its temple in Emesa, vanishing from the history of Rome. The unconquered sun god had been well and truly conquered. The propaganda was so effective that it shaped all subsequent historical accounts. The two main sources for his reign, the senators Cassius Dio and Herodian, wrote their histories under the new regime. They had every reason to portray Elagabalus in the worst possible light, both to justify his murder and to praise the new emperor, Alexander. They painted a portrait of an unhinged pervert, a caricature of Oriental decadence, and for nearly 2,000 years, that has remained his dominant legacy. The restoration, however, was built on fragile foundations. The Severan dynasty had been mortally wounded. While severe as Alexander's reign was, by all accounts, moderate and stable, he never commanded the true respect of the military. He was seen as being ruled by his mother, Julia Mamaea, and lacked the martial authority that the legions craved in an emperor. In 235, after 13 years on the throne, he and his mother would be murdered by their own troops on the German frontier, who then proclaimed a brutish general named Maximinus Thrax as emperor. The death of Alexander marked the end of the Severan dynasty and the beginning of a 50-year period of anarchy, civil war, and fragmentation known as the crisis of the 3rd century. In a strange way, the bloody end of Elagabalus was a harbinger of the chaos to come, a stark demonstration that the Praetorian Guard and the frontier legions now held the ultimate power to make and unmake emperors at will. Looking back through the haze of 2 millennia of hostile propaganda, what are we to make of the boy emperor Elagabalus? Was he the depraved monster of the Roman histories? A proto-transgender figure struggling with identity in a world that had no language for it? Or was he simply a religious zealot, a true believer whose piety was interpreted as madness? The truth likely contains elements of all three. The salacious stories of his personal life are almost certainly exaggerated, the lurid details crafted by his enemies to create a monster. Yet it is impossible to dismiss the core of the story. He was a boy raised to be the high priest of a mystical, ecstatic solar cult, who, through a fluke of dynastic politics and his grandmother's ambition, was suddenly handed absolute power over a world that was utterly alien to him. He did not try to adapt to Rome. He tried to force Rome to adapt to him and to his God. His reign stands as a cautionary tale written in blood. It is a story about the catastrophic collision of cultures, the absolute limits of autocracy, and the violent reaction of a conservative society to a perceived existential threat. Elagabalus fundamentally misunderstood the nature of Roman power. He thought the emperor was a divine king. The Romans knew the emperor was the chief functionary of a military empire. He offered them ecstatic spirituality. They wanted secure borders and stable currency. He presented himself as a divine conduit, adorned in silk and jewels. They wanted a rugged general in a leather cuirass. The contrast between the image he projected and the reality Rome demanded was total and irreconcilable. He was not just the wrong man for the job. He was, from a Roman perspective, an anti-emperor, the living embodiment of everything a ruler should not be. The final, haunting image is that of his body, weighted down and sinking into the brown, churning water of the Tiber. A boy who reached for the sun, a priest who believed he could remake the spiritual cosmos of the world's greatest empire, was ultimately consumed by its earthly filth. His 4-year reign was a brief, dazzling, and horrifyingly strange interlude, a fever dream of clashing symbols, foreign gods, and shattered taboos. When Rome finally awoke, it did so with a scream, and then spent the next 2,000 years trying to pretend it had never happened at all. But the violence of that forgetting tells its own story. The boy from Emesa, in a spectacular failure, exposed the deep, unyielding fault lines of Roman identity, revealing just how brutally the eternal city would defend its traditions against a god and a king it refused to understand.